Well, good evening, and we are all in for a treat tonight, an evening with Henry Kissinger, the 56th Secretary of State of the United States. And as you heard from the rabbi, he was also Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, more commonly known as the National Security Advisor. But one of the many ways in which Henry Kissinger is unique, he was the only person to wear both hats at the same time. Word has it he never lost an interagency argument during those years. Henry is quite simply the great scholar practitioner of our time. It's nearly 4 decades now since he's left public office, but he has remained one of the most influential voices in this country and beyond, and it's proof that someone with an original mind, a sense of history, the ability to speak and write with great clarity and courage does not need an inbox in the executive office building to make a real difference. Our subject tonight is his latest book. I think it's his 14th. I've lost count. World Order. And it's sweeping in its reach, both geographically and in the historical sense. Its focus is a concept fundamental to the field of international relations and American foreign policy, and it's one closely associated with the rules by which the world operates or at times does not operate. And in many ways, the subject brings Henry full circle. It's back to his doctoral dissertation, which is a study of the attempt to build a world order nearly 2 centuries after the emergence of the modern state system in the mid-17th century, and in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. So now he's brought the subject up to date, and he discusses efforts to promote world order during the Cold War and in the quarter century since. Indeed, this November is the 25th anniversary of the coming down of the Berlin Wall, so the timing could not be better. What I will do is begin by asking some questions, and then obviously we'll open it up to yours. But first, let me just welcome Dr. Kissinger and congratulate him on the publication of his latest book. But I want to begin with what I think is the obvious first question from anyone looking at the cover, which is, Henry, why did you publish a book that doesn't have a subtitle?
Actually, in England, they gave it a subtitle.
Oh.
Okay, what's the next question?
It makes sense that they gave it a subtitle in England. You know, the formal name of the country is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so they're into rather long approaches. So let's begin then with the basic, because Henry, as you all know, was a professor. So Professor Kissinger, just help people for a second understand when you use the phrase world order, just give us a working definition, give us a handle on the concept.
Well, the basic point that I was trying to make in the book is this. In many regions of the world, some kind of order has existed at some period of time. By order, I mean either that the region was dominated by one ruler or one country, or that there were a number of states that balanced each other enough so that a degree of physical order could be maintained. And secondly, in order to have a world order, you need both considerations of power and considerations of justice. That the majority of the units, or in fact almost all the units of such a system, have to believe that it is basically just, because if they don't, there will be constant rebellions, as we now see in the Middle East, where several revolutions are going on simultaneously. So what I am doing in the book is, first of all, to discuss the regional orders that have existed. But for example, the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire didn't know anything about each other, so you couldn't talk about a world order. In our time, every region of the world interacts with every other region. On the other hand, they come from different traditions, sometimes have different notions of justice, different notions of order, and that is the challenge that I'm trying to discuss.
You know, the modern state system now is what, roughly 4 centuries old. Was there ever a golden age in history where you said, that's kind of what we're trying to aspire to, it was pretty good, and it ought to be something like that we're aiming toward now?
You can never, I don't know. First of all, one has to remember, when one thinks of international politics, the international politics we read about in the newspapers today, it's based on the notion of the state. That's new. That was new in the 17th century. That didn't exist before. Secondly, in most regions of the world, states didn't exist in that case. In China, the notion of the sovereignty of states never developed because China thought of itself as the Middle Empire, and for them, the problem of order was a problem of governance by the emperor. So when we talk of international law and balance of power, we in the West, we're talking about primarily the European and North American experience. In those terms, I would say the best period was between the Napoleonic War and the emergence of Germany as a unified state in 1871. There were no wars between major countries. There was an agreement, more or less, or substantially, on what constituted a just arrangement. And there was substantially a balance of power. But that's very hard to apply in the contemporary world.
I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, which was, the state is a relatively recent invention. Goes back to the mid-17th century. Has it become something of an endangered species? You see challenges to the state now, say in Europe, from the EU, and you see challenges to the state from various militias and terrorist groups and so forth. Should we have the state now on a postage stamp as an endangered species?
Well, let's define what we mean by state. When we say it was an invention, it is because until then, governance was based on personal obligation to the ruler, and therefore on the personal expression of his preferences. In the 17th century, the then French chief officer of the Cardinal Richelieu invented the concept of a state that exists independent of the ruler, that has its own requirements of survival. He expressed it by saying the individual looks for salvation in the afterlife. The state, however, is immortal.
Is what?
Immortal.
Immortal.
It doesn't die, so it cannot look for salvation. And it has to deal with its necessities. And the kings were considered then servants of the state, the highest servants of the state. So the state as a continuing organization, that came into being in the 17th century. So, but it depended on general acceptance of that principle. In the world today, There are non-state organizations in many parts of the world, a few of them economic, many of them political, many of them religious, which challenge the authority of the state and which are strong enough to challenge it and make it stick. And in those conditions, you get vast areas of the world that are not governed at all, like Libya today, in effect like Syria. And then you have the chaotic conditions, which depend entirely on the mutual ability to use force.
Let's talk about the Middle East. You've alluded to it a few times. The president recently basically said, yeah, the world looks messy, but he was slightly dismissive of it. But when you look at the Middle East, it seems to be turbulent or worse by any measure. It's very hard to speak of order. So what do you find useful to try to understand what is going on in that part of the world? How do you make sense of it?
Well, first of all, one has to understand what is going on and has to define it properly. There are a number of revolutions going on simultaneously. One is the revolution against the state. And that's an issue of who has power, which group in the society has power. Then there's a conflict between the secular and the religious orientation. Should the state be a political instrument or a religious instrument? Then there is a dispute between various religious interpretations of Islam, between the Shia and the Sunni religion. And finally, there is a revolt against the international system that exists there, by which I mean the states that we see, the states we see in Europe have a historical origin. Most of the states you see in the Middle East were created in 1920 by the victorious countries who divided up the Middle East to reflect the European balance of power, but not the ethnic realities or the religious realities of the region. So therefore, when you have these religious upheavals in a state in the Middle East, it cuts across the borders. And what we're seeing in the Middle East is something very similar to Europe in the 30 Years' War, when it was not easy to distinguish between religious and political motivations, when outside countries intervened in order to balance various groups against each other. And so you cannot speak of a political order today in the Middle East, but you know that at the end of this process, some sort of order will emerge, if only because of the exhaustion of everybody. And that is what is open today.
So two things that come from that, because I've also looked at it and agree with you on the 30 Years' War parallel of political religious struggles within and between and among states. One is we could still be very early in that process. As horrific as that is, we could be looking at decades or longer of strife. And secondly, at the end of it, to use a different analogy, it's Humpty Dumpty. It's very likely we don't go back to the post-World War I Middle East that we've lived with for a century. We will, if and when things stabilize, it could be a fundamentally different political arrangement.
In all likelihood, it will be a different political arrangement. And it will depend whether, in the 30 Years' War, it really started on the issue of whether the Catholic emperor could impose the religion on states that preferred or that wanted to become Protestant. Then this was exploited by France, which was a Catholic country, but which, for geopolitical reasons, thought that dividing Germany or Central Europe was better. And this then led to a whole series of wars. We now see we have a Shia and Sunni conflict. But we also have a Iranian-Saudi conflict, a potential Iranian-Turkish conflict, plus a role for Egypt. And none of this has shaken down, in some cases not even within the countries, and certainly not between the countries.
So let's quickly move to another part of the world. We'll probably circle back, which is Europe. If there was one part of the world, if we had had this conversation 2 years ago, we would have said had greater order than the other region. Post-Cold War Europe, to use Ronald Reagan's phrase, look whole and free and stable. And here we are today, and we've got Russia now in complete control of Crimea. You've got instability in large parts of eastern Ukraine. People are talking about strengthening NATO. So what are we to make of this, that the part of the world where orders seem to be the greatest, suddenly orders up for grabs?
Well, the conflict occurs at the dividing line between Europe and Russia. And Russia has always, through the centuries, had a ambivalent or ambiguous position. That is, it wanted to be part of the West culturally, but it also defined itself by an extent of imperial rule that no European state could think of because there were too many of these states. So now Russia, and I'm explaining, not justifying, Russia finds itself, after 300 years of imperial history, back to where it started, geographically vis-a-vis Europe. That's uncomfortable for those who believe in the Russian tradition. Then Ukraine has always had a special place in Russian thinking. The Greek Orthodox religion for Russia, the Russian Christianity, started in Kiev. The first Russian state in history was established in Kiev. And in my personal acquaintance, I do not know one Russian who does not think of Ukraine as a special patrimony of Russia. So the Western concept of dividing lines has a different connotation when applied to that dividing line, especially when it applies to Ukraine.
Can I just press you on one thing, just so I understand? To say that Russia has a special psychological, political, historical, ethnic tie to Ukraine and to Russians there, is implicit in that the thought that what is happening between Russia and Ukraine is not the harbinger of something larger, that this is not a Russian assault on the European order, that this is localized, or do you see this as something bigger than Ukraine?
First of all, I don't believe Russia is strong enough to attack the whole European order. Conceptually, Russia is not comfortable with the large Russian populations that are left in some of the East European countries. But I do not believe they have a sense of urgency to upset. Again, judging by my experience, the strategic worry of most Russians that I've dealt with has concerned Islam and China, and not the West. So the Ukrainian issue has had a particular sharpness because of that historic tradition, and because historians will study it sometimes, how it evolved. And it has some similarities to the outbreak of World War I, in the sense that the issues themselves were comparatively trivial. And each side took perfectly reasonable decisions in terms of the moment. And they gradually escalated it into a confrontation, which then does challenge our notions. And I don't want you to think that I'm saying that Russia is entitled to grab a piece of a country because of its historic view of it. But if one looks at a crisis and asks oneself, how does one want to end it? One has to take into account how it evolved. Nobody in 1914, on July 1st, would have thought it possible that there'd be a general war. And a month later, they were in a general war that killed tens of millions of people. We're not going to get into a general war over Ukraine. But we have developed a state of tension that may have been avoidable, but at any rate has to be understood, and which one shouldn't let continue to fester.
I wanted to draw another parallel to the World War I experience, where this year is the 100th anniversary, year of anniversaries, it seems, which is to Asia. Before World War I broke out, a lot of people said the economic interdependence in Europe made war unthinkable. But as you just said, war happened. Not by design, but it happened. Well, here in Asia's had this remarkable 3 decades plus of economic growth. You've got a lot of rising powers, China, Japan, principal among them, but many others. Yet part of me is uneasy with the potential parallels, that even though everyone benefits from a peaceful, stable region, the rise of nationalism, there are dozens of territorial disputes, there's bitter historical legacies and rivalries. There's nothing like the institutional arrangements that you have in Europe.
And also the readiness to threaten force against each other, which the European countries don't do anymore.
Don't worry. So it's the part of the world that appears to be the most orderly, but does part of you not worry that if something could happen, and if something were to happen, things might be quite brittle?
There are no institutional arrangements that require consultation. And the Asian situation structurally is very similar to the 19th century European situation, that there's a reliance on a balance of power which is not really fully defined, and which in Asia is more complicated than in Europe because the region is so big and some of the dominant countries are so large. So you cannot do in Asia what was possible in Europe, put together a group of smaller countries to achieve a balance. So if I agree that it will be a different kind of issue. The Asian issues are more national, territorial, prestige, national honor issues. In the Middle East, they are more religious, ideological, geopolitical, tied to religious.
And in both cases, you have threats to order in Asia from strong states, in the Middle East from weak ones. But in both cases, you end up with regions that are potentially quite volatile. I want to talk about another issue which was central to your career and central to the subject tonight. When Dr. Kissinger was a relatively young academic, he spent a year or two in an institution where I happen to be now, the Council on Foreign Relations, and wrote a seminal work on nuclear weapons and foreign policy. So the question I have is the relationship between nuclear weapons and order. And it seems to me at one and the same time, nuclear weapons have underpinned world order during the Cold War. Yet now, when we look at Iran, North Korea, and others, suddenly nuclear weapons seem to be one of the greatest threats to order. So what's your take on that?
Well, I was at the Council in 1955, and we had, and I was young, if you can believe that.
You're still young.
And I was, whatever the title was, with a group of really experienced and distinguished people, all of whom had had high office before, and scientists like Oppenheimer and Teller. And I think most of them started out with the theory that nuclear weapons had to be integrated into conventional strategy into some way. And the more one reflects about this, and I could afford to do that as an inexperienced outsider, you ask yourself, how can you bring yourself to the decision as a leader to go to a war that you know will inflict more casualties in its first weeks than both world wars put together in years of war? So, in the study I conducted, that's really been the theme of my thinking about strategy, and towards which the West has gradually evolved, namely that you really cannot use nuclear weapons as an ordinary element of strategy, as a last resort. Well, yes, in theory. But in other countries that are emerging are relying on nuclear weapons in the crude version, an even cruder version than existed in the West 60 years ago. And the problem is compounded by the fact that the Soviet Union interpretation of nuclear weapons, however it started, once you study the issue, you become convinced that you have to start by protecting the weapons, you have to start avoiding getting triggered into war by miscommunication. And with the existing nuclear superpowers can't say they have mastered it, but they're pretty far down the road of protecting their weapons. The new states that are emerging will be in no position to protect their weapons by defensive measures. And therefore they will have an enormous incentive to preempt that when they think they're being attacked, or even when they know that if they can get the first strike in, they have a huge advantage. So when you make then two considerations, you would say Iran gets nuclear weapons, whatever its intentions. Several other countries in the region will almost certainly develop nuclear weapons on their own. They will then, vis-à-vis each other and vis-à-vis Iran, be in the position that I described of having strong offensive capabilities, at least destructive offensive capabilities, and very weak defensive capabilities. It will be a much more volatile world, and one which has the danger that nuclear weapons become conventional and that tremendous casualties will occur. We think of 9/11 as a grave day, but only 3,000 people were killed and there were no wounded. Imagine an attack where 50,000 people get killed and an equal number get wounded. And that's what would happen if cities are attacked, even with Nagasaki-type weapons, not to speak of the larger weapons. So this discontinuity between the nuclear establishments of the superpowers and the emerging nuclear establishments of other powers is a huge challenge. And then when you compound it with an ideology that claims that it is pursuing some divine commandment, then you have a very dangerous situation emerging.
I want to ask you about another technology. I mean, nuclear technology emerged, 60, 70 years ago. And you had people such as yourself and other thinkers made enormous contributions in how to integrate it in ways that were not destabilizing or essentially undermined order. Well, now we live in a world of the emergence and diffusion of cyber technology. And so we have billions of people around the world with access to tremendous amounts of technology. And the question is, will this be a source for stability or instability? How you write about it in the book. What's your sense of how to think about digital technology, cyber technology? What's your take on that?
Well, in fairness to your audience, which includes some people who work with me, so they will be telling you anyway if I don't. I am not very competent in cyber technology.
Somehow we sense that. I don't know.
So in the operation of it, I have no competence. But I've thought about it, and I've studied it. I've thought about its implications. One of its aspects is that in terms of relations between countries, you may know you're under attack, but you may not necessarily know where the attack is coming from. Secondly, you may be under attack in a nuclear world. Not that I'm nostalgic about a nuclear world, but in a nuclear world, at least you could have the theory that you could retaliate in a way that would cause unacceptable damage to the other side, and therefore the other side would have no incentive to attack you. But in the cyber world, if, say, a small country attacks your banking system, which is perfectly possible, you don't get anything out of attacking its banking system because it has no comparable impact. And then there's one other aspect. I've been involved, and I'm sure you have, Dick, in groups that have been trying to discuss this set of issues with foreign countries. And the foreign countries are not eager to tell you what their capabilities are. So therefore, when we talked about nuclear weapons, there were years of discussions about arms control. And however much you might argue, and there are many points of view about arms control, it had one advantage, that in the process of negotiation, the two sides educated each other about their relative technological status. With cyber weapons, I think nobody has yet broken through into a discussion of comparing capabilities. Don't you think? They're discussing what it is you shouldn't do, but not how you shouldn't do. Not even that it's clear.
No, I agree. I think it's actually more complicated in many ways than the nuclear conversation.
Much more complicated.
The technology is emerging and changing at a fast clip. You've got so many actors. You have problems with identification. we need to use these systems commercially and for other reasons. At the same time, we don't want to see them used otherwise. If there's young people actually watching this or here tonight, we also lack an entire we lack the skill set. We lack people who understand the technology, the commercial issues, the law, international relations. We actually need to train.
And within the government, there is no agreement.
Yeah. So it's a good area for focus.
Well, no government is actually admitting that it would be conducting cyber warfare.
Right. Even
though one knows they have the technological capability, and you can't separate it from commercial activity.
I want to deal with one or two other big subjects before we take some questions from those here. One is about the role of the United States in promoting world order. And when you look at the modern era, the last 100 years, the United States has been critical, both when it didn't do things, the impact on world order was largely negative, and then when the United States got involved, and then stayed involved, obviously throughout the Cold War and so forth. So when you look at where this country is now and you read polls about American disinterest in the world, war weariness, whatever you want to call it, intervention fatigue, you come at it with a long historical perspective. How concerned are you that we're facing an era where world order is likely to deteriorate, in part because American willingness to be a constant promoter of it has faded?
Actually, that was my motive in writing this book. This book grew. I had originally not planned to write this book. And I was talking to a friend from Yale, and I was thinking of some more historical projects, and he said, why don't you write about what worries you most? And what worries me most is what Dick has described to you. A world in which you have intelligent actors pursuing, and not all of them will be intelligent, some of them, and then the changing role of the United States. You can go back a long time, but tracing the evolution of American thinking. But one American theme, and maybe the dominant American theme, has always been that we can cut international politics into a series of projects, each of which have a solution, and that we can thereby guide the world towards our preferred solution. What is happening now is we are still the single most important element in the world. But we cannot deal with all the problems by our preferred solutions. And we have to give ourselves, before we even give to the world, an answer to three questions. What are we willing to defend? Or what are we willing to achieve? Because it is so important that we are willing to do it alone, if necessary. What is important enough to defend or to achieve, but only with allies? And what is it we shouldn't try to achieve, because it's beyond either our technical or intellectual capacity? And those are three questions that are essential, because otherwise we will be either overextended or too isolated. And we have suffered from both overextension and, in this period, from over-withdrawal.
I want to come back to your last question, the things we should not try to achieve, which gets at the question of overextension. Would you put in that category trying to turn other countries into democracy, trying to do versions of what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan? Is that is that a bridge too far? And also, coming back to the theme of your book, is it even unnecessary? Do we need to make the world in our image in order for world order? Or one could say we had perfectly acceptable order with communist Soviet Union or with a non-democratic China. We ought to be willing to accept, quote unquote, their imperfections from our own point of view because we have other priorities.
Well, the DNA of Americans includes a preference for democracy and a commitment to democracy. So it is natural for us to give preference where we can safely do so. But it's also true that there are many countries that are essential for security reasons, that if we attempt to make them democratic by military means, we will find ourselves in a very dangerous situation. And one of the things that haunts me is this. I've now lived long enough to see 5 wars that the United States was engaged in since 1945. And I saw all of them at first hand in one way or another by knowing the top people or by actually being the principal policy advisor. There's only one of them in which we achieved our full objectives. That is not a tenable situation.
I assume you're referring to the first Gulf War.
I beg your pardon?
The Gulf War of 1990.
The first Gulf War was the one in which we stated an objective, reached the objective, and stopped and said we'll go no further. We've achieved our strategic goal, and we're not trying to redo the societies.
There's a lot of questions here about the Middle East, as you might have expected. And the question is, in Syria, we just talked about a case of overreach. Is Syria an example of underreach, where the United States over the last 3-4 years did not do much to train an opposition? So now we don't have a local ground partner, where just over a year ago we established certain red lines of Syrian conduct. Those lines were violated. The United States did not respond militarily. Is it your sense that Syria is disorderly in part because the United States has not done enough?
Well, to answer this sort of question, I would say that before you can answer this sort of question, you have to begin with an analysis of what the problem is. The dominant view in our policy making with respect to Syria was there is this evil man, Assad, who is oppressing a population that uniformly wants democracy. And therefore, if we remove Assad, or if somehow Assad leaves, democracy will develop. But that is not the reality of Syria. The reality of Syria is that there are a number of ethnic groups and religious groups that are, and the one Assad represents is one of them, but there is no uniform view of an alternative to Assad, and not necessarily a democratic view, because every group really wants its own view to be dominant. And so I would have thought one could make a good argument on moral grounds to remove Assad, but one should first have in mind what does one want to, how can it be held together? Now, I think, and what do outside powers think about this? I think any outcome in Syria has to take into account the ethnic diversity. And if we had done more, well, the question is, what does one mean by more? By more? I am very allergic to involving ourselves when we cannot describe the outcome. And so I would first like to know the outcome.
Would that same allergy have limited your enthusiasm for what we did in Libya?
I was totally opposed to what we did in Libya for the reasons. I know it's sort of boring to have somebody say, I told you so, but for the reason.
It's like being married. You hear it a lot.
Well, I did not believe it was possible for a unified government to emerge in a country that had so many tribal divisions. And now we have, this is now a non-governed region that is a threat to all of its neighbors and extremely difficult to get back under control.
Henry, there's a lot of questions about China. And obviously, the United States and China are likely to be the two dominant countries for the next era of history. To what extent do you see them potentially agreeing on what order ought to be, essentially coming to a common definition? Or to what extent, and you know there's a whole school of thought among academics that it's almost inevitable that the United States and China will clash in the way that existing and rising powers have often found themselves at odds. What is your perspective on the ability to manage this relationship?
Well, as a historian, one has to agree with the academics who say this, because rising powers step on the toes of existing powers, and the more these countries interact, the more they can make life more difficult, and they therefore visualize each other as permanent enemies. But if you look at the consequences of letting this evolve, then the consequences of a military clash between China and the United States would make the experiences of the world wars pale. And we also have to know, and we do know, that none of the leaders who started the First World War would have done it had they known what the world would look like at the end of it. So therefore, I believe, despite the historic analogies, we have an obligation, and the Chinese have an obligation, to work to see whether some kind of constructive relationship can evolve, and to work at it seriously, and not just with words. And that is complicated by the fact that Americans have a very pragmatic outlook. We think every problem has a solution. The Chinese have a very conceptual outlook. They think every solution is an entry to another set of problems. So to get them to talk, to get the two sides to talk about the same thing is not easy. I believe it's the duty of both sides to attempt to do this, because if you imagine a accentuated rivalry, then every country will have to choose between one of the two sides. The whole world will be radicalized. And the outcome would, I do not see any positive outcome from that.
A lot of questions about one aspect of the Middle East we didn't discuss, which is the Israeli-Palestinian question. And the potential, given what has gone on and what is going on there, for any agreement if you will, on local order between those parties, or to come back to an expression, a version of what you just said, whether that is a problem to be solved or simply a condition to be lived with.
When you say a problem to be solved, in much of the discussion, this is put forward as if on some magic day, the two sides will sign an agreement. They will call it peace, and afterwards will live with a consciousness of harmony and no further tensions. To me, that's inconceivable that that can happen, because the most well-meaning Palestinians will be part of a Muslim tradition and of a consciousness of lost territories. And therefore, I have had the view, which is a minority view, which is this: the attempt to achieve a solution to every aspect of this problem is going to lead to endless esoteric discussions which never will come to a conclusion, and if they were to be concluded, there would be so many bystanders who would question it that they would undermine it. So I have thought that it would be better if, for example, if Israel granted a degree of sovereignty to the West Bank, which is more or less agreed to anyway without solving every last issue of Jerusalem, returning Arabs and Palestinians and so forth. But the issue is not whether I have the right solution to this. One must attempt to negotiate it without inflaming the whole region in the process of negotiation. And we need, at least, when I was in government, I had the great fortune that the main Arab counterpart I had was President Sadat of Egypt. And he was, or became in the process, at least apparently, and I think really, committed to a peaceful solution that everybody could live with. I don't think that the Palestinians alone can do it. They need some major Arab country that not only tolerates it, but supports it. And I don't see that right now.
Got time for maybe two more. You made some news this week about Cuba, and a lot of people are interested in the question of whether the option of attacking Cuba was something that was seriously considered, ought it to have been. And in retrospect, here it is. We've now had sanctions against Cuba for more than half a century. What are we to make? What lessons should we take away from this?
You know, the lessons you should take away from that story is the way the media now handle fragments of information. Here was the situation. In the Ford administration, we had made a major effort, not publicly, but a major effort to see whether relations with Cuba could be normalized. In the middle of, or before that effort could culminate, the Cubans sent an expeditionary force to Angola to support the communist-supported, now remember, this is the height of the Cold War, and brought about the victory of the communist-dominated group in Angola. Simultaneously, or a little after, the United States began to negotiate about a evolution of Rhodesia and Namibia towards majority rule. And so then the question arose, if we go on with this process towards South Africa elsewhere, and if everywhere the Cubans then appear as military forces, what do we do? That was the reason. There was no abstract discussion of attacking Cuba. There was a discussion, what do we do? And all these papers say is that President Ford said, and I supported, and Scowcroft supported, let's study what we should do. It was a contingency plan. It was not a plan for action. It was never put before any NEC discussion. I don't think there were more than 3 discussions on that issue. So to present it as if there was an attack, an imminent attack on Cuba, if President Ford had won the election, there would not have been an attack on Cuba unless the Cubans, just look at the absurd process of the United States and the Soviet Union are engaged in a conflict, and the Cubans are sending military forces all over Africa. And so if the Cubans had sent forces, I don't know what we would have done. We would have certainly reacted. If the Cubans had not sent military forces, we had no intention of attacking them. And we had demonstrated it by having had a year of discussions about normalization before this process. And the lesson to draw from this sort of discussion is not were we right and were the critics wrong. The issue is serious people were facing a serious problem, and we're trying to deal with it with serious solutions. And to present it as a kind of personality conflict just misunderstands how foreign policy is conducted.
Last question. I'm surprised when I go through this stack of cards, one word or 2 words that never appeared in the stack of cards were United Nations. We haven't discussed international law, so I'm curious. You've written a book called World Order. To what extent does this organization down the street from here, down the east side, is it a factor, or is it basically not all that much of one?
I think it is a factor, and in some categories, a very important factor. For one thing, it provides an easy meeting place between adversaries who would otherwise have difficulty sometimes reaching each other. It provides a mechanism for supervising the solution of issues. In many technical fields, it is extremely helpful in developing countries in conflict like the South Sudan. What it cannot do is to solve disputes among permanent members of the Security Council or among major countries that should be in the Security Council but are not because of that it cannot do because it doesn't have the power to do it, and it doesn't really have even the legal structure to do it. But the role of the General Secretary as a mediator or as a collector of conflicting points of view and as a carrier of messages can be very important. So That would be my view of the United Nations.
Henry, I want to congratulate and thank you for your most recent book, which I really do urge people read. I want to thank you for your being with us tonight. And most of all, I want to thank you for your contributions to this country's foreign policy and its security for many decades, sir.
Thank you.